Ladies and gentlemen, kindly be seated as we prepare now for the arrival of the Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the arrival of the Prime Minister of Singapore and our dialogue participants and our moderator for session 2. And a very warm welcome to our Prime Minister and our participants for our second session. We're going to allow the media a couple of moments to have their photo opportunity before we hand over to our moderator for session 2. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's now hand over to our moderator for our second session. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Norman Pearlstein, Chief Content Officer, Bloomberg LP. Mr. Pearlstein.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning for an hour in which we shall discuss the state of the world. And given that that seems like quite a bit of time for such a subject, I thought we would begin by asking Prime Minister Lee if he could give us a quick overview that would set the stage for our discussion. So, good morning.
Morning, Mr. Pearlstein. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be back at the APEC meeting in Jakarta or in Bali and be talking to this distinguished audience. The last time Indonesia hosted APEC was in 1994, and at that meeting, the Indonesian leadership, together with the other leaders, announced the BOGO goals, a target of free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. And it was an ambitious program to boost trade and investments, reducing barriers, promoting the flow of goods, services, capital. And indeed, over the last 20 years odd since then, APEC, guided by the BOGO goals, has played a significant role in catalyzing the integration and the regional development of the Asia-Pacific. Tariffs have come down by half, goods trade has quadrupled, and APEC economies have grown twice as fast as the rest of the world. And that includes the developed as well as the developing countries. But if we look at just at the emerging markets, in fact, they've grown 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. Today, 20 years later, we've made a lot of progress in the Asia-Pacific. But it's a time of uncertainties for the global economy. In America, there's a weak recovery going on, but the political problems are far from resolved, as you can see from the federal government shutdown, which is going on right now, and has made it impossible not just for the administration to carry on his normal diplomatic activities, but also to address the longer-term structural problems with a fiscal deficit, with investment in infrastructure, with education, which a lot of sensible observers know that America needs. In Europe, too, there is stabilization, but at the same time there remain deep structural problems. They've taken significant measures to calm the markets, to quell the panic which was there a year, 2 years ago. For example, the European Central Bank has significantly shifted its stance, and goes beyond its original anti-inflation mandate. But some very basic problems will be there for a very long time. First of all, there's no sense of political identity in Europe, which enables them to operate as one country which can manage their banking system as one country which can have a fiscal policy, which can have transfers, which can have the successful countries helping the less successful parts of Europe to move along. In the same way as the United States works when it works. No, it's a real structural problem. Many of the countries have competitiveness issues. They can't all become like Germany, but they do have to make significant changes in their social safety nets, in their labor laws, in their safeguards, in their willingness to adapt to a very rapidly changing and open world. And it's not just the southern European countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, but even some of the other countries, including France, which need to make changes and where there's really not a clear consensus yet amongst the population that this is the way they want to go. And therefore, we must expect in Europe, we hope, a continuing gradual progress, but from time to time, the risk of mishaps and the fundamental problems reasserting themselves. In the developing world, the prospects are brighter, provided the countries continue to strengthen their infrastructure, continue to strengthen their business environments, continue to improve the basic conditions which have allowed them to grow steadily and vibrantly over the last 20 years. In China, growth has slowed this year, maybe 7.5%. But I think the leaders know that they have to work on these issues, that there are economic reforms which need to be done, that their social safety nets need to be built up, healthcare, housing, education. Infrastructure is in hand, but the other issues which have to take place on a very big scale are very vexing ones. And everybody is watching what the new leadership is going to do. The third plenum of the Central Committee, which is when they make major policy decisions, is about to happen in November. And everybody is watching that to see which direction the new leadership will take. There are some signs. They've launched a new experimental free trade zone in Shanghai, which is going to have more freedoms for services, and particularly for financial services. But how that develops will be something we'll be watching closely. But China cannot be the only story in Asia, because Asia is a very big continent, and the rest of Asia has also to prosper as well, because otherwise it will be imbalanced, and I think there will be a lot of tensions and difficulties which will arise. Japan is part of the Asian story. Mr. Abe has set a new tone since he took over last December with Abenomics. It's a catchy term, but it encapsulates the idea that Japan has to make some fundamental changes in order to set itself right after a very long period of malaise and stagnation. Mr. Abe talks about three arrows: monetary policy, a very drastic form of quantitative easing; fiscal policy, spending more, getting confidence back; and most importantly, the third arrow, structural reforms, which will get the Japanese economy set right over the long term, and including participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership as one lever to open up the economy. We all hope that he will succeed, but structural reforms by their nature are things which take years to implement and more years to show results, and we hope that the Japanese will be able to stay the course and show the results. Because from the point of view of the rest of Asia and Southeast Asia, a vibrant Japanese economy has a lot to contribute. Southeast Asia itself is doing quite well, all things considered. The potential is there. The combined population is the size of the EU. The combined GDP is among the largest economies of the world. It's got the resources. It is progressively consolidating its economic regional cooperation. ASEAN is talking about ASEAN 2015, a vision of an ASEAN community, and we are making progress in that direction. So, besides Asia, there are other parts of the world which we should also look at, and we must not think that Asia is the only story in the world, because in Latin America there are countries doing well, in Africa there are also countries doing well. It varies, of course, greatly, but it's a time of rapid change and flux in the world. But continued prosperity for our countries depends on two broad factors. One, that countries do things right on their national policies, and two, that they do things right cooperating with one another. On national policies, you talk about infrastructure, we talk about skills development, we talk about promoting innovation, and improving the overall business environment to encourage private sector to grow and develop. And amongst that, also addressing concerns which businesses have. And PwC recently did a survey which I think surfaced some of the issues, strengthening regulatory and legal frameworks, making procurement processes more transparent. I think the countries know what the issues are. The challenge is making it happen. But countries need to work together as well in order to get the regional context, backdrop right. Removing barriers to trade, particularly non-tariff barriers, improving supply chain flows so that the trade can move with minimum hindrance, and pursuing FTAs, bilaterally, regionally. We've got many such projects going on in the Asia-Pacific region. I think the one which has the most attention is a Trans-Pacific Partnership, because the US is participating with countries on both sides of the Pacific. But there are other initiatives as well. There's a Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is on the west side of the Pacific. There's the Pacific Alliance, which is on the east side of the Pacific. And these are all building blocks eventually towards the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, because it's a complex region and we can't go in one big bang. So different pieces overlapping, eventually merging into a coherent whole. But the regional context also depends on peace, stability, security, because that's a prerequisite for any economic progress. So there will be business opportunities in Asia in this environment. The middle classes are growing, incomes are rising, people are traveling, people are spending, lifestyles are changing. And that's a tremendous business opportunity. There are also opportunities for production, because as more countries join the global economy, as countries like Indonesia and Vietnam improve their business environments, there will be opportunities for companies to invest, to manufacture, to export, and to create prosperity wider in the region. But we hope that the businesses will also do their part to promote this process. Firstly, encourage governments to be open and not to go for protectionist measures. I know everybody says this, but I know every business lobbies their government in order to look after their interests. But it's important to maintain that public support for openness and integration, because unless you have that, if we all close ourselves up, or even hinder the process of trading and doing business with one another, I think we're just going to make things worse for all the countries. At the same time, businesses can provide concrete feedback to governments on what they need to do more, or how they need to perform better. And the feedback has resulted in useful initiatives through the APEC process. For example, we've got the APEC Business Travel Card, we've got the Asia Region Fund's Passport, and we hope that we get more ideas from the business people. Every time we meet as APEC, we meet the business community, and from these, new initiatives can come. So we value forums like the CEO Summit We get a chance to talk to you, and we get a chance to hear you as well, and hear your concerns, and pick up ideas from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. Dennis Nally, as chairman of PwC International, you preside over the publication each year of the APEC survey of CEOs that Prime Minister Lee referred to in his comments. I wonder if you could talk about some of the key findings from this year and perhaps focus specifically on issues regarding attitudes toward infrastructure and toward consumer demand.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Norman. And good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you today. This is actually the third year that PwC has conducted this survey in conjunction with APEC. And hopefully you have a copy of it. I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think there's a lot of great information in there, not only from an overall perspective, but also as it relates to individual countries. As was indicated earlier, this is the most comprehensive survey we've done to date. About 470 CEOs and executives actually participated in this year's survey. All 21 APAC countries were involved in this. So I think it's a very good look at how the CEO of the business community is actually feeling about the prospects for the next several years or so. It's a comprehensive report, about 30 pages. Let me see if I can boil it down to about 4 or 5 key points to stimulate maybe some thoughts. First off, I would say some good news. CEO confidence levels are actually up this year as contrasted to a year ago. And I think that's a very positive message, notwithstanding the challenging economic picture that we're collectively looking at around the world today. 42% of the CEOs that participated in the survey are very confident about their revenue growth over the next 12 months, and that compares to about 36% a year ago. So again, a very positive trend in terms of confidence levels coming from the CEO community. Also on a good news front, prospects for employment actually look good. 70% of the CEOs that responded to the survey are actually adding headcount over the next 3 to 5 years. And only 11% actually plan to reduce headcount, and that compares to about 26% a year ago. So a much more positive view around the outlook as well as jobs going forward. In terms of investment, I think some interesting information. Again, more good news. 68% of the CEOs are actually increasing their investments in the APAC economies over the next 12 months. And I think that really sends a very powerful message around the importance of this part of the world to the business strategies that they're focused on. And we asked the CEOs what's behind this. Their messages were actually fairly consistent. First and foremost, they look at the emergence of the middle class and the continued development of that, which is going to create all kinds of opportunities. Certainly the rapid urbanization that's taken place in many of the 21 APEC countries. And then finally, a real demand, as the Prime Minister indicated, for infrastructure development, all driving the growth agenda, if you will, looking forward. When we look at where investments are to be made over the next 3 to 5 years, the CEOs identified 3 primary countries involved. First, not surprisingly, China. Second, Indonesia, right here today, and then the United States, which I think is an interesting perspective in terms of the top 3 destinations for investment. And when we talked about, how are the CEOs planning to deliver the growth that's envisioned in their business plan, they really unanimously focused around the emergence of the middle class as driving their growth agenda. And what's really interesting to me anyways is that they're really focused on the development of new products and new services that can really meet the demands of this emerging middle class. In fact, 25% of the CEOs in the survey plan significant changes. 25% actually plan significant changes to their product mixes, brand and customer service agreements to really capture this growth, which I think is a real trend in terms of what we're beginning to see here. And what's really interesting about this point is that when we go back to 2006, and we talked about the growth agenda back then, as everyone in this room knows, it was all about labor and manufacturing efficiencies, and now we're talking about new products, new services to really capitalize on the middle class. So a really interesting change in focus in terms of how the CEOs are thinking about the growth agenda going forward. The fourth point I'd make is what's really holding the CEOs back today from achieving the growth, from making the investments that they're really trying to achieve. And the first, as the Prime Minister indicated, a lot has to deal with the regulatory consistency around intellectual property, governance, which really could unleash even more investment, more realization of the growth potential, which is interesting. And the second, which was also alluded to, which is the need for increased focus and level of investment for infrastructure in order to realize the potential that really exists, in this part of the world. And finally, maybe just to close, we talked about the CEO's assessment of what's really been happening from a trade negotiation standpoint. And by and large, I think the CEOs are very positive about the ongoing development, the ongoing discussions around individual trade negotiations. In fact, 69% of the CEOs have actually said that the multiple trade tracks that are being pursued in this part of the world are going to clearly create additional opportunities for them to achieve their growth objective. And to me, what was really interesting about this, you go back to 2001, there were actually 5 free trade agreements that existed in Asia. And today there's 71 in place, but what's really interesting is there's another 84 in negotiation to realize this potential. So a continuation of movement to really open up the trade amongst countries within APAC. And that's the good news. The challenge, I think, that exists here on the trade front is really how do you deal with that increased complexity? How do you really deal with the increasing cost of dealing with these multiple trade agreements? And ultimately, I think there's a clear message from the CEO community to continue to evolve this to get a much more aligned and consistent approach to dealing with trade in this part of the region. I think that's even a further indication of the ability to really achieve the growth agenda and the potential that really exists in this part of the world. So bottom line, good news, positive stories, challenges, yes, but I think some real opportunities coming through the survey. And again, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the survey results. I think there's a lot of information that could be useful as you think about your business and you think about the next several years. So.